Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 408 for the 11th of Teves in a regular year. Hate has been given a really bad rap in our society, maybe starting with the hippie movement in the 60s, I'm not sure, but there's this idea out there that we're really supposed to love everybody, love everything, accept all things, love is like the common phraseology. But what we're going to be learning about in today's Tanya is that not only is this not true, it's actually absurd. Because in order to truly love something, you actually also need to have the emotion of hate at the same time. What do I mean by that? If you really love something, if you really love your parents, let's say, or your spouse or your siblings, something like that, then what is it that you're going to automatically hate? Anything that's going to oppose you from getting close to them. So, for example, if you have a loved one who lives overseas, like I have family that live overseas. My mother and my sister, they live in Israel. My father lives in Canada. So my family is all over the place, right? And I love them very much. And thank God, I'm usually able to visit them pretty often. But over COVID, all the travel restrictions were in place. And it was a really kind of scary moment where there was like this feeling of like, when, if ever, am I going to see them again? When are the borders going to open up? When is flight going to be allowed? Like that was, an intense couple of years that we lived through where travel was really, really restricted. And yeah, in that moment, there was a certain like hatred for the travel industry or for COVID or for, the COVID policies or whatever it is, even like whatever was holding me back from visiting my family. And I remember attending some online meeting of some sort where people were talking about, where's the first place that you're going to travel to once travel opens up? What are you really excited to see? And I was like, I want to see my family. That's the first thing that comes up in my mind, But at the same time, with that love for my family, there's also this extreme hatred towards anything that's going to oppose me from connecting with my family. So you can see this in many ways, right? Also, if you love a child, let's say you really, really love this child, what are you going to hate? You're going to hate anything that might come to harm that child, anything that will come in harm's way of that child. So there's many examples of this. And this is the basic idea, is that in order to truly love something, you have to also have that emotion of hate there. As much as it might not be comfortable to talk about, it actually is true. And we'll see this today when we discuss the topic of today's Tanya is going to be this discussion of tzaddikim. So if you recall in the very beginning of the Tanya, we talked about this idea that the Gemara brings up 5 categories of Jews. There's the tzaddik v'tovlo, the tzaddik that it's good for him, the tzaddik v'ralo, the tzaddik that it's bad for him, quote unquote, the Beinoni, the middleman, the intermediate man. And then there's the Rasha v'tovlo, the Rasha that's good for him, and the Rasha v'ralo, the Rasha that's bad for him. And we started talking about, we began a discussion back then about the different categories and what these different categories involve. And we spoke about the fact that despite the common misconception that people think that tzaddikim are people who just like keep all the mitzvahs and do all the right things, Rashaim are people who go around sinning all day and just are really wicked people, and Beinonim are like kind of somewhere in the middle who kind of half their lives do good things, half their lives do bad things. The Alter Rebbe totally dismissed this, and he gave a much deeper definition to these terms. And he spoke about how the Beinoni actually is a very high level. The Beinoni is somebody who behaves perfectly in thought, speech, and action. Their behavior is perfect. So then if that's the case, what is a tzaddik? And today that's what we're going to be discussing, delving into, is what is a tzaddik? What makes a tzaddik? And in fact, as we mentioned, there's two types of tzaddikim. There's tzaddik v'ralo, a tzaddik that it's bad for him, and tzaddik v'tovlo, a tzaddik that it's good for him. And what do these two things mean? Now, this discussion is it's important for us to understand this and to know this, but really mainly to help us understand what we're not, because the vast majority of us reading this Tanya, understanding and learning this Tanya, are not tzaddikim and will never be tzaddikim. And that's actually okay. The book of the Tanya, as we mentioned previously, is called Sefer Shel Beinonim. It's written for the intermediate man, for people who can become intermediate men or women, who can change their behaviors in thought, speech, and action, even if their inner motivations will never change. And that's really the core difference between a tzaddik and between a Beinoni. A tzaddik, unlike a Beinoni, not only is behaving in the right way, but they've actually changed their internal motivations. They've changed their insides so that they no longer want to do things that are against God. So a Beinoni very much has cravings, has urges. He's a normal person like everybody else. It's just, this is somebody who, has human foibles on the inside. They just have controlled themselves to the point that they have this self-control that they don't actually indulge in any of these cravings, which is a really amazing thing to do. But now a tzaddik is somebody who not only is in full control of their capacities, but has actually changed their capacities, changed their motivations, changed their cravings and their urges so that they don't want negative things anymore. So then what's the difference between these two categories of tzaddikim? And this is what we're going to be learning about today. And as we'll see, a tzaddik v'ralo, the tzaddik and it's bad for him, quote unquote, this is considered to be a lower level of a tzaddik. And this is somebody who, yes, indeed, they don't crave negative behavior. They don't crave negative things that go against the will of God. But it's not because they've actually transformed their insides so much. It's actually because they've suppressed these urges. So they've suppressed them to the point that they no longer have a hold on them at all. They're not walking around all day and getting these urges that they need to constantly suppress. They've suppressed them so much that they're as if they're not there. Versus a tzaddik v'tovlo, a tzaddik that it's good for him, that's somebody who actually has transformed their urges to the point that now their cravings are not only just like not for physical things because they're being suppressed, but they actually have transformed all of these cravings that they once had for physicality and for worldly pursuits for God, for the sake of God. And where does hate come in? So as we'll learn when we get into the text of the Tanya, this is the telltale sign to distinguish the difference between these two tzaddikim. Because while a tzaddik v'ralo, the tzaddik that it's bad for him, might not have a craving for physical things in the world, for things that go against the will of God, they don't hate these things. They just kind of like, it's sort of like they don't feel connected to them in the same way because they've really disconnected from them and they've suppressed their urges so much. Versus a tzaddik v'tovlo, how do you know somebody's a complete tzaddik, otherwise known as a tzaddik that it's good for him? This is somebody who not only do they not have cravings for things in the physical world, but they actually hate them. They actually have a despise and disgust towards these things. So a tzaddik gamor is living in such a state of awareness of godliness that they really see reality for what it is. And they see that things that are against the will of God are not only just not something that they've controlled themselves and they don't feel this urge towards them, but they actually disgusts them. It doesn't even look good to them anymore. That maybe we can relate to this is in terms of addiction, like severe addiction. So as I mentioned on a previous episode, I recently read a book all about addiction that was really fascinating by Gabor Mate called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And so to an addict, to a hardcore, let's say like heroin addict, to them, when they see heroin, they get very excited and they like the heroin and they're drawn towards the heroin. Then maybe, let's say if they're like an addict in recovery, then they are able to, control themselves to such a point that they still feel that craving for the heroin, but they're able to control themselves. They've built up a bunch of safeguards so that they won't be able to get this heroin. Maybe they've have family members who hold on to their money for them. Maybe they've checked themselves into a program or whatever. So the craving is still very much there. If you were to ask them, do you like heroin? They would say, yes, I do, but they don't let themselves, they've put up safeguards for that. A higher level, let's say a addict who's been in recovery for many, many years, maybe at that point, they actually have suppressed their craving towards heroin. They've suppressed it to such a point that it doesn't really have the same effect on them as it used to. They don't need these same safeguards and everything. Nevertheless, they identify with this statement that once an addict, always an addict. And they do kind of like have this like little part of them that understands what it's like to be an addict and understands what this idea of the craving is, But then if you have somebody who really transformed themselves, and this is a very, very, very high level, this would be somebody who has transformed themselves. They've gone through such a strong level of recovery that now heroin to them is utterly despicable. It's disgusting. It's not, somebody could throw heroin at them all day long and they would just throw up. They would hate it. They would not want it, like very sincerely, really not want it. So maybe most of us hopefully can't really identify with the heroin analogy, but maybe we can identify it with it in other ways. So like I know for me, for example, I'm quite intolerant to gluten or to wheat. I know it has a very, very bad effect on me, but at the same time, it tastes really good, right? So when I see cookies, then in the beginning, when I first started to realize that like cookies had a very bad effect on me, then in the beginning, it took a certain level of self-control for me to hold back from eating cookies. Then at a certain point, it became like kind of like second nature, which is like sort of like, I'd go to a Shabbos table or whatever, and there's cookies on the table, and it's like my craving for the cookie is so far suppressed that I almost don't even see the cookie anymore. But there are times, and I won't say that this is true all the time, but there are times when even I'm able to look at the cookie and it actually is disgusting to me because it actually, all I see is it represents unhealth. It represents like, all I see is like just sugar and chemicals and everything. And it doesn't even look appealing to me on any level. And it actually, in a certain sense, I could say that I like hate that cookie. So it doesn't always happen. And maybe for you, I don't know if you could identify with this example or not. Maybe you can find something else that you could identify with. But ultimately, it is kind of difficult for us to truly gain an appreciation for this in a true sense, because when we talk about a tzaddik, we're not just talking about, drugs or cookies or things like that. We're talking about like very basic kind of things like, nourishing food, gossiping about people, utilizing every moment of Shabbos in a proper way. Like there's so many intricacies in terms of serving God that we may not even recognize. And a true complete tzaddik is somebody who their whole life is so consumed in their love of God that anything that opposes that is truly something that they hate, truly something that they despise. So let's see how the Alter Rebbe explains this. And for context, we're beginning chapter 10 today of Likkutei Amarim. And today's chapter is kind of a continuation of yesterday's section that we learned, where we're talking about the idea of the animal soul and the godly soul and the motivations for each, and how each one wants sole rulership over the body, and how there cannot be two rulers in the body. At any given moment, there has to be one that's in control over the other, and they're at constant war and constant battle. So today, the Alter Rebbe describes a situation where somebody actually succeeds in having their godly soul rule over to the point and fights with the animal soul to the point that he actually pushes away, he actually evicts the negativity from the left ventricle of the heart completely. And the Alter Rebbe brings a pasuk for this, a citation that describes this from Devarim chapter 21, verse 21, where it says, that you should eradicate the evil from your midst. So the Alter Rebbe is saying is that this is a description of something on a more a subtle soul level, is that this is a description of somebody who has eradicated the negativity from their midst, from within them. But now the Alter Rebbe specifies that it's not in this case, in such a case, it doesn't mean that the evil has been transformed into good, but rather such a person is called a tzaddik she'eno gamur, an incomplete tzaddik, or otherwise known as tzaddik veralo, a tzaddik who it is bad for him. So what does this mean? Why tzaddik that it is bad for him? So tzaddik veralo, it means that there's still a teeny little sliver of this negativity, of this ra, of this bad in the left ventricle of the heart, just that it's really, really subdued and it's totally nullified to the good because of its small measure, because of its small amounts. Like it's very minute. And because it's so small, it's like as if the person basically like evicted it. It's as if it's totally not there. But the truth is, if it was totally evicted, if it really, really was not there at all, then what would happen to it? It would turn into good. So what does that mean? What does that mean? That like if it really truly were evicted in a real sense, then it would be transformed into good. So the Alter Rebbe says, let's explain this. So when we talk about a tzaddik gamur, a complete tzaddik, this is somebody who's all the negativity within them has been transformed into good. And this is why they're called tzaddik v'tovlo, a tzaddik, and it is good for them. So that's why that word good is in there, because it means they're only filled with good. There is no negativity in them. And this happens when the filthy clothing are totally removed from the evil within the person, from the negativity within the person. And what this translates to mean is that this tzaddik gamur, this complete tzaddik, totally despises all of the pleasures of this world. And he finds it really gross and disgusting when he sees how people are indulging in the physical world, like how people actually do get pleasure from these things, and how people are doing this just in such a way as to just really indulge their physical bodies, and that there's no sense there at all of serving God. Like they're not indulging for the sake of serving God. They're just indulging for their own physical needs. This is something that this reality is so totally despicable and repugnant to a complete tzaddik. Why? Because this person, such a complete tzaddik, recognizes the fact that all of these physical worldly pleasures come from klipa and from sitra achra, from the husks and from the other side. And anything that comes from sitra achra, anything that comes from this other side, the complete tzaddik hates it with utmost hatred, due to their tremendous love of God and for God's holiness, and this ava rabba that they have, this which we call the ava rabba b'ta'anugim, this great love of pleasures, in the sense of godly pleasures, and this great affection, this great measure of affection that we described above, in regards to God. So this is what I spoke about in the introduction, this idea that like out of their tremendous love of God, this translates into a parallel hatred towards anything that opposes God. Because the sitra achra and the klipos, they oppose God. They're on the total other side of God. And the Alter Rebbe brings a citation of this from Tehillim, chapter 139, verses 22 to 23. He sort of paraphrases it, where he says, Tachlit sin'as snatim lo'ivim hayu li chakreni v'da levavi v'gomer. I hate them with a consuming hatred. They have become enemies to me. Search me and know my heart. So this is a description of David HaMelech, where he's talking about his hatred of anything that opposes God. So the Alter Rebbe here is translating this to mean physical pleasures, that worldly indulgent pleasures that have to do that a person indulges in purely for their own sake, without any regard for utilizing them to serve God. And the Alter Rebbe says that it's equal in measure. The more a person loves God, the more this tzaddik gamur loves God, that's going to be the same measure through which they hate the sitra achra, and through which they have such a repugnance towards anything negative, towards ra, towards bad, because repugnance is exactly the opposite of love, just like hate is the opposite of love. So basically the Alter Rebbe is saying that, like, just as we described in the introduction, that anytime you have love, you also have to have hate. So repugnance, like disgust, is in that category. If you love something, you're going to find anything that opposes that thing that you have totally despicable to you, totally disgusting. So now the Alter Rebbe goes back and he says, okay, this is in contrast to the tzaddik she'en no gamur, the tzaddik that is not complete. He does not have this hatred, with utmost hatred towards the sitra achra, towards the other side, and thus, since he doesn't have this hatred towards the sitra achra to the same extent, he isn't going to hate. He isn't going to find evil totally repugnant, totally disgusting, the way that a complete tzaddik would. And since this is the case, then we know that since the hatred and since this disgust is not complete within this person, then it must mean that there's still a little small measure of love to have pleasure, to derive pleasure from these things. So it means to say, so meaning to say that the Alter Rebbe is basically saying, like, by, through deduction, if we see a person who does not, this isn't, when I say if we see a person, it's not something we can observe from the outside, but if there is such a person who does not have complete hatred for worldly things, for things that go against God, this means that there's love there for them, because each one is in contrast to one another. If there's not hatred, that means there's a level of love. Obviously there are measures of love, but they always go together, these two things. And what this means is that the filthy garments, as they're called, the bgadim hatsuim, have not been totally removed from them, and that means that they didn't totally transform the negativity within them into good, and it still has like a little bit of a hold on them, on these kind of people. So it's like, again, it's like the addict who, okay, sure, most of the time, pretty much, it's like they're not tempted by their addiction, and even if like somebody put the addiction right in front of them, they really, not only would they resist it, but they wouldn't even feel temptation towards it. But can they truly say that they hate it? Maybe yes, maybe no. And that would really be a sign of how recovered they really truly are. And so just in conclusion, the Alter Rebbe says that this is why such a person who, yes, it's like they're not tempted by evil anymore, but they haven't totally eradicated and transformed evil, is called a tzaddik veralo. It's the tzaddik and the ra. The tzaddik, the evil, the negativity, is subdued and nullified to him. So that's that's sort of like another reading of this, like tzaddik veralo, the tzaddik, and it is bad for him. It's like the tzaddik, and if you know Hebrew, it makes a little bit more sense. It's like the tzaddik and the bad is nullified within him, rather than the tzaddik and it's bad for him, And so since there is this negativity still within him, even though it is nullified, it is subdued, and all of that, he's not going to be complete, and his service of God is not totally complete, and that's why he's called an incomplete tzaddik. So that's it for today, and we will continue tomorrow when we conclude chapter 10, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.